Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming today. As Ken said, my name is Jessie Hronešová, and I'll present you today the outcome of my research on ethno-national identities of young people in post-war Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I'd like to start with a quote from one of my respondents when I did my fieldwork in Bosnia that said, "I mean nothing in this country. I don't really know who I am." And I think that this quote pretty much represents really well what I found when I was doing my fieldwork in Bosnia, how confused young people in this country that went through a very brutal and violent war quite recently are dealing with at the moment. And just to give you a little bit of a background to what I did during my research. So this presentation will be based on fieldwork that I did in 2010 that was originally part of my MPhil thesis that I submitted at Oxford University in 2011, and I conducted over 30 face-to-face interviews with young people across Bosnia. And I traveled to quite remote rural areas, especially in Eastern Bosnia, which was the area where most of the brutal crimes, human rights violations happened during the war, such as Srebrenica, Foča, Žepa. And I spent a month in Srebrenica, as a matter of fact, and I also worked and lived in Sarajevo, which is the capital of Bosnia, and Banja Luka, which is the capital of Republika Srpska, which is a part of Bosnia and Herzegovina, as I'll present you in a minute. And I'm really sorry if a lot of you know quite a lot about Bosnia. I wasn't entirely sure what type of a background to give you, but I'll try to keep the background to the minimum so that you can follow the presentation. So I'll first start with the background, then I'll try to frame what I'm talking about when I'm talking about identities, a little bit what it means for Bosnia, and then just a flavor of the theory on identities that's quite extensive. And then I'll go into the actual fieldwork, and I'll try to present you these questions through the eyes of my respondents and how they establish their identities, through the content of identities, or how they see the content of identities, and how through my life there, I'd see how these identities are being perpetuated in the country, through localization and through politicization. And then at the end, as Ken already said, I'm happy to answer any of your questions, and we might analyze what is actually the outlook and what's the situation at the moment. Probably the first question that comes to mind is, why would we be even interested in a topic like this? Why is it important to study identities? Well, my starting point was that, I'm interested in reconciliation in post-war building, and I would like to understand, what would be able to help these societies to overcome, brutal conflicts, and how to be able to live together again. And, identities in post-war societies are usually quite important, quite salient. And I thought that, to understand them through the eyes of people that actually live there, would bring us a lot of insight about how post-war multi-ethnic societies actually function, and how can we help them to overcome the problems that they're facing. And I was also working with this assumption that young people are basically future leaders of any country, and especially in post-war countries, they play a very significant role, because if there's any potential for change, it must come from young people. However, in a country like Bosnia, or as a matter of fact, in any post-Yugoslav country, these young people that were born either, imminently before the war, or during the war, or right after the war, they don't really have any recollections of the pre-war life, how it was during communist Yugoslavia, when everyone sort of lived together. There was a lot of course, illusionism about how it actually looked during Tito's Yugoslavia. But working with young people in post-war Yugoslavia and post-war Bosnia is also bearing in mind that all they remember is either the war or the post-war situation in the country. So they've lived surrounded by mediated narratives from their parents or the media or schools, and environment that's scarred by the war that recently happened and that ended only in 1995. And so I thought it's really important to identify what influences the plasticity or rigidity of their identities, and especially ethnic and national identities, also for policymakers, when they're trying, for instance, to improve the educational system or any other youth policy. So those were my starting points. And sorry for the a little bit corrupted map of Bosnia and Herzegovina, but Bosnia is in southeastern Europe. It borders on Croatia, Montenegro, and Serbia. And the black arrows are showing you where I did my fieldwork in cities, and the red arrows denote where I did my fieldwork in rural areas. So you can see that I was mostly based in Eastern Bosnia, in the parts that are bordering on Serbia. Just a bit about the Bosnian War. Bosnia before the war was a communist republic with a mixed population of Muslims that are usually now referred to as Bosniaks, Croats that are mostly Catholics, and Serbs as Orthodox Christians. And these were the three constituent, so-called constituent nations. And then there were the so-called others, the other minorities, especially Jews and Roma. And it was a very mixed population. It was, out of all the Yugoslav countries, Bosnia had the most inter-ethnically mixed population. And of course, you know, when the wars of dissolution of Yugoslavia started, the main question in the country was is actually Bosnia? Whom does it belong to? Is it a Serb country? Is it a Croat country? Is it a Bosnian or a Bosniak country? Whom does it belong to? And that was basically the fundamental question, you know, that you can see throughout the entire war. And so a full-fledged war started after a referendum on Bosnian independence in March 1992, when, you know, the Serbians did not even participate in the referendum. And it was ended only at the end of 1995 with the so-called Dayton Peace Agreement that basically divided the country. And I just wanted to show you the patchwork, the ethnic patchwork of Bosnia in 1991 when the last census was conducted. And as you can see, the yellow represent Croats, the green Muslims, the red Serbs, and the rest is where the population was extremely intermixed and with a lot of minorities. It was basically a patchwork. It was nearly impossible to create a clear division between ethnicities apart from some areas. Well, if you look at the situation, sorry again for the corrupted map, if you look at the situation after the war, it's what basically happened during the war was ethnic homogenization of parts of the country, and the black line there in the middle, that's the so-called inter-entity boundary line, because Dayton Agreement created two entities within one country. One entity was a Bosniak-Croat federation, so-called Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the second was a Serbian territory called Republika Srpska until this day. And just for your information, most of the articles of the Dayton Peace Agreement, and especially Annex 4, which is the current constitution of Bosnia and Herzegovina, has not been changed until this day, although the agreement was meant to be only temporary. And so if we look at the consequences of the war, apart from all the large-scale human rights abuses that we still hear about because of the International Criminal Tribunal of the former Yugoslavia that's still prosecuting some of these human rights violations, such as Srebrenica or the siege of Sarajevo, ethnic cleansing, rape, etc., there were over 100,000 fatalities, over 100,000 people died in Bosnia, 1,300,000 were internally displaced, and then there was over 1 million refugees as well. So a country that had, you know, before the war, 4.4 million inhabitants, at least 50% of the population was extremely displaced, dislocated from their pre-war housing. And of course, all the economic consequences were 80% drop in industry production, and especially a lot of thousands of landmines that are still in the country. Many of them are still there, devastated roads, and a third of the housing destroyed. But what is most important for me and for my research and for this presentation, I guess, is that over 100,000 people left the country by 2004 only. And this trend is by no means dying away. It's, you know, basically Bosnians have no visa obligation towards the European Union anymore. And a lot of young people are leaving the country. If they have the economic means, if they get scholarships, they leave, and many of them never return. So there's a huge brain drain within the country. And of course, as one of the major consequences of the war, that the pre-war multi-ethnic structure of the country was basically ripped apart, and that ethnicity, religion, nationality sort of became one and a fundamental anchor of identities and fundamental categorization that we're going to be talking about in this presentation. So what is actually identity when we're talking about identities? I mean, it can mean anything. Of course, it's a very contested concept. Some would say it's a catch-all concept. It can mean anything. Self-understanding, collective identification, group solidarity, sense of sameness over time, or it might be a set of fundamental conditions of social being, such as gender. It can mean anything. And, it can be psychological, but it also has this social dimension. It's outward-looking dimension of how others perceive me, not only how I perceive myself. And so the social dimension, this is where, we're studying ethnic, religious, and national identities especially, although the psychological part, of course, plays an important role as well. And so the study of social identities is nowadays usually looked through the either instrumentalist or especially constructivist approach that I also aligned with. And scholars such as Eriksen and Calhoun would be dealing with social identities and defining them, and they would be basically saying that any social identity is formed in opposition to someone else, to the so-called other. So it's always this bipolar us and them. They're interactive and they become fluid through social contact. So I know what I am based on what I am not, in a way. And it was especially Frederick Barth that I mostly used throughout my research that worked with ethnic identities. And, in his seminal work in the 60s on boundaries and group identities and ethnicity, he was basically saying that it's intensive social interaction across boundaries, ethnic boundaries, that matter much more in maintaining ethnic identities than the cultural stuff that they enclose. So what he was saying is it does not actually matter where you were born, who are your parents, what's the stuff that your identity inwardly has. What matters is who you interact with. But he was basing his studies mostly also on immigrant societies. It's quite common knowledge that immigrants would usually have very strong identities when they live abroad, whereas it would not be the case, when everyone around you would be the same, so to speak. So, his theory would be like, because I'm Czech and I would meet a Pole in London, I would immediately know that I'm not Polish because I don't speak Polish, my language is Czech, and this would be the boundary between us. Well, but when we look at postwar identities, there's a lot of similarity, but then we find a lot of differences as well, and that's what I was looking at. Of course, identity in postwar societies has a role as this form of security. You're same as the others, and you like to, clinch to what you know. And ethnic affiliation in this respect, and in a country like Bosnia, then becomes very, very rigid, because it's your anchor, and it's your sense of security. And these identities are extremely polarized in post-war countries, because the division is not only us and them as speaking a different language, but us as victims and them as perpetrators, which in the case of Bosnia would usually be us as victims of Srebrenica most of the time, which is Bosnian Muslims, and them as perpetrators, meaning Serbs or Bosnian Serb army. But what we have to take into consideration, as you saw on the map, on the post-war map, is that in divided societies, there's basically not that much of this social contact that Barth is talking about. So there isn't that much of this interaction that I can create my identity based on knowing what I am not. Well, and of course, in post-war societies, we also have to take into consideration the political side of it, how these identities can be easily manipulated by political leaders for political aims, such as elections. So ethnic voting is basically still, until today, a rule in Bosnia. And so now when we go into the actual fieldwork that I did in Bosnia, I'll try to present you the identities of these young people that I talked to across Bosnia. So the first thing that I was probably struck by was this extremely low sense of any type of civil identity. People would present you with multiple passports, but they would often say, oh, well, it's just a piece of paper. It doesn't really mean anything to me. Bosnia on paper has no meaning, inner meaning, emotional meaning to me whatsoever. It's just a piece of passport. And only a minority of people would have any type of sense of Bosnian Herzegovinian identity, that their identity would be based on being born in a country rather than being born into, to, I don't know, Orthodox Christian parents or Catholic parents, let's say. And then there's this other thing that sometimes for foreigners is quite hard to understand, is that ethnicity and nationality in the country and in the language especially pretty much means the same. So nacija as ethnicity is merged with nationality and as basically as a people, národ. And on top of that, to make it even more complicated, ethnicity, there's basically an equation between religion and ethnicity. So you have this compounded identity, confessional ethno-national identity, as a matter of fact. So that's why I titled the work that I did Ethno-national Identities, because I don't think that ethnic would be able to describe what we're talking about, neither would national. It's this identity that people would have there is extremely complex, comprehensive, and it has at least these three components, fundamental components. Well, and then when I would get into the interviews with people and I would start asking them about, so what do you think is most important regarding your life here? And I was trying to get to, of course, what their identity is. However, I would avoid direct questions about identities. And the first thing people would start talking about is their descent, their families. Bosnia, in many respects, is still a very traditional society where family matters much, much more than, for instance, from the type of environment that I come from in Central Europe. And then there comes into this picture also ancestry, so role of history is closely interlinked with families. So, for instance, what my Serb respondents in Republika Srpska would often refer to is that these Bosnian Muslims, they're actually Turks, because in the 15th century they converted to Islam, they betrayed their people, and they accepted Islam because it was easier. As one of my respondents, Danica in Banja Luka, said, they, meaning Bosniaks, had to accept Islam in order to simplify their life. And then on the other side, Bosnian Muslims or Bosniaks would be often referring to bad Serbs as Chetniks, and Chetniks were monarchists during the Second World War with quite a bad reputation after the war, and they were then misused during the most recent war. And in the same way, Croats would be referred to Ustaše, which were basically World War II fascists, that created their own puppet state. And so, people would start talking about their family history in relation to these historical events, what their father did, what their grandfather did, and they were, proud about their family history. And that would be one of the first things they would start talking about, which was quite interesting for me to see. And then the other thing, of course, as I already mentioned many times, was religion. Because religion there basically became a cognitive shorthand for identifying a person. You put a person in a box based on his or her religion. I wouldn't even say what my religion was. I would just say I'm an atheist, which probably wasn't the best idea either, but I would not want to be referred to as a Croat only because I was baptized as a Catholic. But that basically happened in many respects. For instance, there were some Polish researchers who got into a municipal census. Somehow they got involved, and they were being interviewed, and they said, "Oh, we're Catholics," and they were put down as Croats, but they were Poles. So there you can see that the ethno-national confessional identity is just basically like 3 in 1. And so in Bosnia, when you're a Catholic, you're automatically considered as a Croat most of the time. The same thing as if you're an Orthodox Christian, you're automatically considered a Serb. And if you're a Bosnian Muslim, you're automatically considered or referred to as Bosniak. Although many people actually don't like this term, that would be another long story presentation. It's in many respects a very politicized and artificial term for many people. But I would of course still encounter some quite liberal people who would not agree with these terms and with these labels, and they would say, "Oh, but we're all the same after all." As my parents said, during communist Yugoslavia, we all lived together happily ever after until the war. But then I had this, test question, and I would ask, okay, fine, so you're a Bosnian Serb, would you consider marrying a Bosnian Muslim? And in 99% of the cases, they would say no. But the reasons were mainly practical. Whether the children would be baptized, what school they would go to, in which city they would live. Because, as we'll see later, there's quite a lot of divisions within cities. And so intermarriage was something that was basically a taboo across Bosnia and across people with different views. But then I met someone like Svetlana, who was a graduate student in a city close to Sarajevo called Palet, that was actually the headquarters of the Bosnian Serb army during the war, and there's still quite a lot of Serb nationalists living there, so that's maybe why her views are so extreme in many respects, although positively extreme. So she said, "I wish I had been born in Spain or Sweden, God I wish. No one would call me a Serb, because my parents are Orthodox Christians." So there you can see what an effect it actually has on an individual who has to live in such an environment. And then what's probably the most confusing about, former Yugoslavia and that region is language. Because although everyone understands everyone, apart from some parts, but within Bosnia everyone understands everyone, because of politicization of these identities, people would tend to call their language differently. They would call it Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian, depending on what their religion, what their ethnicity, what their ethno-national identity was. However, they would be still speaking the same language that I could understand. So, I would talk with a group of people where someone would be a Croatian, someone would be a Bosnian, someone would consider that's how they would, refer to themselves, as a Croat, as a Bosniak, as a Serb. All speaking the same language, but all calling their language differently. And I would be understanding all of them. And the difference that there actually is in the language, it's mostly regional. It has not that much to do with nationality or ethnicity, as a matter of fact. There's regional differences, there's dialects, but the fundamental difference, it's a similar difference as British English and American English in many respects. And so, then I talked to this young Bosnian Muslim in Eastern Bosnia who basically said people just speak what they learn to speak in their homes. There's so many local dialects. We all speak the same language, only in 3 variants. I cannot say what Nazi, meaning ethnicity, a person from Bosnia and Herzegovina is, if I don't know his name. But I can say where he's from, Sarajevo, Krajina, or Herzegovina, based on the dialect he speaks. So there you can see that this language, the language division is basically, it's artificial. It's not based on some objective differences in languages. And many people appropriate this strand. So Miloš, who was a student of, I think, engineering in Banja Luka, and he was also working for an NGO, he said, he basically gave me a history lecture on that all those languages in the former Yugoslavia basically come from Serbian. Even Slovenian, that's very much different, comes from Serbian. So he said all these languages are basically Serbian. And then, as already partly implied in the previous quote, you can easily distinguish what nationality a person belongs to based on names. So if you meet an Ante, you would know that he's probably a Croat, or 100% Croat most of the time. If you meet a Milan, that he would be a Serb. If you meet an Amir, that he's a Muslim or Bosniak. These names basically give away these categorized identities, and so names are sort of distinctive ethnic markers in the countries, and they stigmatize people. There's cases when people change their names into internationally sounding names in Bosnia. Especially, there was a case of one political party where the leader changed his name because he did not want to have a Muslim or Arabic sounding name, so that his background would not be immediately revealed. And then I had cases like this girl who was breaking up with her boyfriend, and she told me that one of the reasons why he broke up with her because she had a Chetnik sounding name, meaning Serbian sounding name. However, her name was Katarina, which is quite an internationally sounding name. So you can also misuse this. And so young people are basically being branded already by the names that they're given, and their identities this way are being defined. But what I was mostly looking at, through life there, and I also lived an entire last year in Bosnia, was how these identities are perpetuated in the country, how this content of identities in many respects is being misused or used. and what influences it. And of course, the most obvious one are physical divisions. The country is divided by this inter-entity boundary line that I would personally call inter-ethnic boundary line, because that's what it basically turned into. There's still some divided schools when, for instance, Bosniak children would go to the school in the morning, Croat children in the evening, and they would never meet. They would have no social contact whatsoever. In the capital Sarajevo, you would have 2 bus stations. One would be the bus station of the Federation, sending buses within Federation, and then you would have the Serbian bus station, and you would have to go there if you want to go to Belgrade, for instance. So cities are still, Mostar is probably the most obvious case, where cities are still divided. They exactly know which area belongs to whom, which one is the Bosnian Muslim, which one is the Croat. And I was actually even struck by the fact that it's quite expensive to travel across Bosnia, around Bosnia. It's around 30 euro round trip from Sarajevo to Srebrenica. And Srebrenica is in Republika Srpska, believe it or not. And it takes a lot of time because the infrastructure is still quite appalling. And it's quite expensive. So, the economy is not that great. Young people don't have a lot of money. So they're even prevented from traveling by these, sort of indirect means. And of course, when you travel across Bosnia, you can see that the landscape is still extremely scarred. But you can see the visual remnants of the war, skeletons of houses. There's still mined areas, mass graves that are marked, divergent, different war monuments. And then, as I already said, media and school, they're all presenting various interpretations of events or wartime events, but even different historical events, or, the languages that are being taught are, as I said, different, although it's one country. Names of cities and places are being changed, just to correspond with what the political leadership in that particular area wants to achieve. And then there's all these various other identity markers that are quite subtle. Flags are not subtle, but for instance, color green, I never realized that color green would actually matter that much, but it does bother Serbs who come to Sarajevo. They kept saying that Sarajevo is all in green, and we don't like it. We can't buy our products there. They have different beer than we like, and all these religious symbols, and so on and so forth. So this is, for instance, a street sign in Sarajevo, and I didn't realize that actually they were right. All street signs in Sarajevo are now green. They did not used to be, but now they are. This is an area in Eastern Bosnia where mines are everywhere, and there's quite a significant amount of areas like this. This looks absolutely beautiful. It's Drina River, and it's a lake. However, this lake is basically the biggest mass grave ever discovered in Bosnia, because when they were cleaning this lake, which is when this picture was actually taken 2 years ago, they discovered thousands of bodies at the bottom of the lake, Peru. So you can see how scarred the landscape is, even if you don't see it from just the looks. This is just posters that are sometimes to be seen around Sarajevo. And, every park in Sarajevo basically turned into a cemetery, into a graveyard. I was quite frustrated living there because there's not that many parks anymore. Every single park was turned into a cemetery during the siege of Sarajevo. And, as I said, skeletons of buildings. This one is from Herzegovina, for instance. And again, another cemetery. And so, apart from all of this that young people have to face and deal with, there's all these transmitted war memories. They themselves have vague recollections of the war, so they basically live fed with these second-handed memories, that are intermediated through parents, media, schools, etc. And so Svetlana, this girl that I talked to before, who lives next to Sarajevo, I think she summarized it perfectly well in what she told me once. I was 8 when the war started, and no one asked me anything. And then you grow up surrounded by ethnically cleansed areas, nationalist media, religion that is enforced upon you, and history that is totally petrifying. Everyone has its own version of history here. I don't feel that the war is over. People hate each other on the basis of their Nazi ethnicity. The new generation is even worse than the older ones. The young ones hate even more because they grow up with those nationalist stories and they do not know anything else. Only a collective lobotomy would change things here. So that's her very bleak prospect. And when we're talking about these divisions, there is really a clear division between the Federation and Republika Srpska. And so, when I was in Banja Luka, I was quite surprised how distant in psychological terms, not only in physical but psychological terms, young people in Republika Srpska are from Federation and Sarajevo. So for instance, this student said, "For me, Banja Luka is the center of this country. Sarajevo is not a springboard to a better life. It is in the Federation and they care only for themselves. I don't like it as a city. They keep painting everything in green and women are veiled." Or another one would say, "The entire Republika Srpska cheers for Serbia." And mind you, Republika Srpska is in Bosnia. But I will of course always cheer for Bosnia if Serbia is not playing. Slowly we're reconciling with the fact that we live here. So there is a bit of a, it's getting better than it used to be, of course. But still, it's not ideal. And I was also looking at my field notes from the trip, and when I arrived from Banja Luka to, from Sarajevo to Banja Luka, I noted down, I was scared when I arrived to Banja Luka. Nationalist graffiti was omnipresent, usually saying Kosovo is Serbia or Mladic is a hero, and just the Serbian flags and the symbol of the Orthodox Church. And so even I, as a foreigner, was a little bit, scared when I arrived to Banja Luka because I was surrounded by a completely different environment. So now imagine how, people that live there and that don't come with this, let's say, open mind that I would think that I had, have to feel when they travel across the country. And so I was, as a matter of fact, at the end of my fieldwork, I was a bit desperate and I was just searching for Bosnians, for Bosnian and Herzegovinians. But I didn't really find that many. And as Katerina said, there are all these nationalities and ethnic groups in Bosnia apart from Bosnians. Ask whomever you want. They will tell you that they are Bosnian, Serbs, or Croats. Maybe only 5% of people would call themselves Bosnian and Herzegovinians. And so I mean nothing in here because of my background. I might be better off leaving. Sorry, there's a mistake. So, this is the quote that I started with. And again, it's quite a bleak prospect. But there still are people that are trying, like she is, for instance. She's of a mixed background. That's why she's saying that she means nothing in the country. Her father is a Croat and her mother is a Serb. And people of mixed background basically are classified as the other. They don't have the same rights. There's a case in front of the European Court for Human Rights because of that. And, their social position basically within the country is much lower than of the so-called 3 constituent nations. And so what are the solutions? Well, let's hear what Ariana, she's an NGO worker in Sarajevo, and she's basically trying to find solutions to this problem of a divided country. And this is one of her stories that she told me, and it might imply a solution, or not a solution, but at least a prospect. So she said, there was this religious Muslim boy from Sanski Most, which is in central Bosnia, who goes to Madrasa, it's an Islamic school. And so during our training course, he shared a room with a Croat boy. And the young Croat did not know how to react when he saw the Muslim boy praying and bowing. He felt ashamed. But now they're good friends. These kids grew up surrounded only by their group, and they call Bosniaks Turci, meaning Turks. They hate something or someone that they do not know. And I think this is the fundamental message that I'm trying to say. It's quite easy to hate someone when you do not know the other. And so, what is the conclusion and what are the prospects and how can we look at the situation and what can we learn from this situation? It is important to know the other, to have informed identities. And that is not the case in Bosnia with young people. So it's pretty much the other way around than what Barth was saying, in the beginning of the presentation, as I said. It's not social contact that makes identities more rigid in Bosnia. It would actually make them more flexible, more open, and more porous. And of course, then we can get into questions about the economy, as I said, that people cannot travel because of economic reasons. People are leaving the country because of economic reasons and unemployment. And then also, we could think about building some, collective, mutual, shared future or looking back to some collective mutual shared memories. That was, for instance, the Olympics in Sarajevo in 1984, which is still a very important event in the history that everyone is still talking about. And so those are pretty much the only suggestions that I would have, and that's my very probably pessimistic conclusion. So there's a question by Carl Prinsloo. Intensive social interactions across ethnic boundaries matter much more in maintaining ethnic identities. Does this imply that identity is formed by comparing oneself to the differences that exist with other? But in Postwar you speak of affiliations. Are these contradictory? Let me just reread the question. Does it imply that identity is formed by comparing oneself to the differences that exist with other? Yeah, well, does this imply that identity is formed by comparing oneself to the differences? No, I don't think these are contradictory. I mean, if I understand your question, affiliation is yeah. I mean, affiliation. I was probably using it as a synonymous term to identity. But could you rephrase maybe your question? I'm not entirely sure that I understand. There's another question: whether I have encountered anyone with a positive outlook. Yeah, I have. I was active in some NGO work as well, and there's quite a lot of young NGO workers that are trying to organize events for people of multiple, I mean, from various ethnic backgrounds, to bring people together, and they are still positive about what can be done, but that's usually done at the local level only. So in small municipalities and villages, etc. There's another question: how do I think the issues in Kosovo regarding youth identity equate to the issues in Bosnia? I think there is a difference regarding Kosovo and Bosnia, because when we look at numbers, the situation in Kosovo is slightly different in terms of ethnic composition of the country. Of course, there's just as clear of a ethnic division in Kosovo, just as in Bosnia. But the situation in Bosnia is much more complex, and I think it's not such a fundamental issue for young people in Kosovo as it is in Bosnia, because you have these pockets, Serbian pockets in Kosovo, where there's not that many young people left in the first place, to be honest. And so basically the identity in Kosovo, I feel, is quite straightforward. It's a Kosovar national identity. Okay, so now just rephrasing the question: knowing the others to have informed identity. Is one's identity based on comparing oneself to others, e.g. I am X because everyone else? Yes. Yes. Because basically what's in theory was the idea is that if I didn't know anyone, if I was the only person on this planet, I wouldn't really know what my social identity was, because I wouldn't be interacting with anyone. And so the fundamental components of my identity would be based on what I am not, based on what I see next to me, if that makes any sense. Yes, so informed identity, what I mean by that is knowing the other in terms of how the other is, how they act, how different they are, to be able to make an sort of informed decision on what I am, if that makes any sense. There might be more questions.
Yeah, it looks like we have some more guests typing. We'll give them a second for their questions.
Are your findings and conclusions unique to the Bosnian situation, or transferable and applicable to other post-war areas with multiple ethnic groups like Rwanda, Iraq, Afghanistan? Yes, as a matter of fact, parts of the research that I did were interlinked with the situation in Northern Ireland. and also the situation in Bangladesh. I would not entirely be sure about Rwanda, to be honest, because what happened there was on quite a different scale, and that would probably need a little bit of a different approach, I'd say. But I think this is applicable to Iraq and Afghanistan in many respects, and other research supports this, that divisions usually work in the short term as a sense of security, but in the long term they create these unbreakable divisions in societies, and especially for young people. Another question, do you think, according to your research, Bosnia and Herzegovina would be better off if it splits into 3 different independent countries? No, definitely not. Firstly, there's going to be a census organized this year, and you'll see that there's not that many Croats. I mean, pretty much everyone in the country is convinced that we'll all see that there's not that many Croats left in the first place. So there would not even be, a territory that they could create as their country. And regarding Republika Srpska, if I could just go back to the end of my presentation, there was actually another picture where I just wanted to show you, because I was sort of expecting this question. It would not be a viable country. It would not be a viable territory. I think the situation, there we go. This is how it would pretty much look. I don't think the situation would improve whatsoever, because you still have some Bosniaks left in Republika Srpska. You have quite a lot of people of mixed background living there. These people would be sort of like trapped in this new country, and it would not be even viable in terms of infrastructure. So I don't think it would solve the situation. It would just create more problems. Sorry, we have more questions. What kinds of events, activities solidified their sense of identity? Thinking things like soccer, etc. Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I actually unwisely went to a couple of these soccer games, and yes, this is a very good example. I mean, after all the war in Yugoslavia, some say, started in a soccer field. Yeah, this is a good example. Not only going to soccer games, but also watching soccer matches. People do, in Republika Srpska, people do tend to cheer for Serbia. There was one game when Portugal was playing against Bosnia, and a lot of people were actually cheering for Portugal's only so that Bosnia would lose. And it's sort of like this identity despite everything, because a lot of these Bosnian Serbs feel like they're trapped in a country that they don't believe in. So any international event where Serbia would be playing, they would support Serbia. Did you discern any organizing centers in BIH culture bridges? Yes, there's quite a lot of them. There's a center for intercultural dialogue, interreligious dialogue, sorry. That is quite active. There's a lot of small NGOs that are usually run by young people. But let me just tell you how extremely difficult for them it is to be running these centers because of political reasons. A lot of them, when they'd ask for some grants, they would not be granted that money because of various bureaucratic reasons. The money would be, taxed, and they would never get the amount of money that they needed. Also, international donors are basically leaving the country. So there's less and less, although to my mind, what the country would now need would be more and more. And also because of some previous events regarding NGO work in the country, NGO has sort of turned into an insult, something very negatively perceived, because a lot of people made a lot of money because of these international organizations funding local NGOs. But there still are some, and if you want me to, I can send you a list and I can put you in touch with them, and they're quite active. But as I say, their activities are now being hindered by lack of finances. Do you think European identity can trump their ethnic identities? If so, wouldn't be effective for the EU to accept Serbia first and BIH as EU members? I do believe that European identity would be a good way how to trump these ethnic identities. but I don't think it's a panacea. I don't think it's a nostrum that would, solve all these problems. And I do think it would be a good idea to accept Serbia and BiH together to the European Union, because now Croatia's entering the European Union, and the effect that is probably gonna have on Bosnia, although it has already happened, is that everyone who can get a Croatian passport has already gotten a Croatian passport. And so when Croatia now enters EU and then Serbia enters EU, those Bosnian Serbs and Croats, they would have even less incentive to actually stay in the country or to have any affiliation with the country whatsoever, because to them, in their eyes, it already is a backward country, and this would only make this worse. So I really do think that European identity is something that should be, in a way, supported as an alternative. However, it's not going to be a fast and smooth process. What is the Bosnian intellectual elite's attitude toward the identity of the country? Well, that is a problem, because if you put down Bosnian, there is a Bosnian intellectual elite, which is the multi-ethnic, multicultural intellectual elite that is basically basing their identity on what it used to be like before the war in many respects, on the multi-ethnic character of the country. However, there is also Bosnian intellectual elite that is Bosnian Serb, Bosnian Croat, and Bosnian Muslim, that have their own perspectives about what the identity of the country is. And it's not the identity of the country, it's more like their individual identities, particular identities, that mostly, apply to their own groups, that are favorable to their own groups. So, you cannot construct a civic identity that can last forever. Yeah, well, what is that a question, or is that a statement? I mean, there was the only civic identity that you can still find in Bosnia, for example, would be this strange Yugoslav identity. It's this affiliation, this naive remembrance of what it used to be like before the war. And that's probably the least harmful, I'd say, in many respects. Oh, it was in response to my previous question about EU. Yeah, of course. I mean, you cannot construct a civic identity that can last forever, and definitely not a European one. And plus, the European Union is not as popular in the Balkans as it used to be. It's still quite popular in Bosnia. It's very popular in Kosovo, but it's not very popular in Croatia, for instance. And it's definitely not popular in Serbia. But I still think that a European identity would be able to have the same function as once Yugoslav identity had in many respects. But that would require that Europeans are looking at people in the Balkans as as they're on par, they're equal. But that's not the way. The way other countries are usually looking at the Balkans is as this backward part of Europe that we sort of have to tame. It goes back in history, but I think that's still the main attitude towards the Balkans. This identity, another question, this identity nostalgia, is it more with the elites or just other folks, older folks? Does it affect the youth much? It actually does affect the youth. So those people that I was talking about, that would be the only Bosnian Herzegovinians that I would find, were mostly of mixed background, which means that they don't really have any other choice, because they cannot align themselves with any of the groups, so to speak. And they would be referring to the former Yugoslavia, because from their parents, usually that's what they would hear, and it's a very, I guess, naive, and rosy picture of what it used to be like. But it does affect quite a lot of the young people. And for instance, one of the most popular bars in Sarajevo, it's called Cafe Tito, and that's where most of these people actually hang around and socialize. Another question: Is the EU popularity connected to the fact that the Balkan people are viewed as the East of the West? Yes, definitely. Negative popularity about the Balkan people, I meant. Yeah, I mean, yes, and also, the European Union has introduced quite a lot of, it has imposed, I'd say, quite a lot of programs and regulations that people are mocking in the country, also in terms of education. The fact that the visa liberalization has taken so much time has, it has really frustrated a lot of people there. And I guess the expectations were much, much higher than what the EU was able to deliver. But at the same time, what immediately after the war the EU delivered was basically nothing. And then when, things started moving, then it was quite ambiguous. The High Representative, that is still basically the omnipotent, let's say, leader of the country, is not very popular. I mean, the current one is more popular than the previous one, for sure. But his interventions in politics are basically just perceived as if Bosnia is not an independent country and as if it's the EU running the country. And because the economy of the country is not great, then people perceive the European Union as the culprit of this in many respects. And there is a sense of, blaming the outside world for everything that has happened there. Another question. I meant, are there intellectual enterprises led by intellectuals, supported by the government to establish a mutual collective identity memory for the country? Not for the country. Not for the country, but Republika Srpska and the Bosnian Serb leadership would have these think tanks and quite a lot of research being done in universities supporting their Bosnian Serb identity, a distinct Serb identity. And, the government is multi-ethnic as well. There's not one single president. There's 3 presidents that rotate. There's this presidency of 3 presidents. The government needs to be composed of these constituent nations or of representatives of the constituent nations. So, by definition, there cannot really be anything, that would sort of be applicable for the entire country, because there is not a single agreement on what the cultural identity, if you want me to put it this way, should be like. Because there's these 3 opposing views on the history of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And when these people create one single government, there's not going to be an agreement. There's another question. If there is an effort to impose a new idealized identity, like Hassan suggested, how accepting are the youth? Well, firstly, there isn't really that much of it, and if the youth, if the more progressive, let me put it that way, the people of mixed background, they would actually like to see something like this happening, but it's not happening. They blame politicians for, for these divisions that exist, and for playing their own ethnic cards before elections, and I guess a certain amount of people would be accepting of it, but there really isn't anything of that sort at the moment. There's quite the opposite, to be honest. I mean, what you hear from, the representatives in Banja Luka, they're denying the Srebrenica genocide. They still keep denying the Srebrenica genocide. So, their main leader, Dodik, basically said last summer that Srebrenica was not a genocide, that it was a crime, but the scale is being exaggerated. And trust me, when I talk to these people, they would say, oh, it wasn't 8,000 Muslims that died there. They actually brought some people from Kosovo, and this is all just like this big bubble of what actually happened in Srebrenica. So there's these three identities, not only bottom up, but also top down, that exist there. Another question. So what is the role of culture in reconciliation? Obviously, it is a collective trauma full of self-constructed myths. Yet, from my experience, all Balkan people seem to follow the same culture, heavily influenced by the Ottomans. Oh, absolutely. I mean, food, I mean, that's pretty much the same for everyone. A lot of those religious traditions that they have, although they call it differently, in essence, they're the same. But that is the problem, because these differences are being instrumentalized as well. although, as with the language, you know, as you say, they're pretty much the same, the culture is pretty much the same. To me, the language is the same. But these differences are being instrumentalized. So, you know, when you go to Sarajevo and you order coffee, you say, I want a Bosnian coffee. And then you go to Banja Luka and Republika Srpska and you say, I want a Serbian coffee. And you get exactly the same. It's just called differently. So, in essence, yes, the culture is the same. However, these different names, at least, make them different. And they instrumentally make them different. Intentionally make them different. And so I really think there's a huge founding ground that a common identity could be built on. Common history, common culture, common language, common, rights and traditions and all of that. However, it's being so easily misused by the political elite mostly to play this against creating one common identity. Another question. In comparison with the situation in the MENA region, to what extent tribalism has a role in defining and determining identity in Bosnia? I don't think tribalism has any defining or determining role in Bosnia. I mean, obviously, there's the main division that there is between rural and urban areas, but tribalism as such is not an issue in the country. It's quite actually interesting to see how people in cities perceive people in villages, no matter what ethnicity, religion, whatever you call it, they are. But because they're villagers, they look down at them. And so, if you want to talk about another social division that there exists in the country, it's between cities and villages, or urban and rural parts. But it wouldn't be tribalism anymore. Are there any other questions?
All right, I think that is all for our questions today. I just want to thank...
Well, if there's no other questions, I'd like to thank you all for participating, and I'm sorry if I was not able to answer all your questions the way you'd wished. I tried.